Hello, everyone. Good evening. Sorry for the delay there, but we're back with another episode of the Archival Discourses. Uh, Tonight, I have returned a very special guest, a man who I've had on this channel a few times in the past, Mr. John Dee. How are you evening, Mr. Dee?
I'm reasonably well, thank you for having me back. It's been a while. Forgive me if I sound a bit thick. I still have the sort of lingering after effects of some sort of lurgy or ague or something. But I shall struggle through it.
No, thank you for your perseverance, Mr. Dee. So, tonight the topic is art and patronage. So, this is something that's been on my mind ever since we last streamed together on the career of Anthony van Dyck, the court painter for Charles I, because obviously Van Dyck was very much patronised by the king, and I just thought it'd be interesting to delve into what do we mean by patronage and what ways can it manifest itself and why is it so important. So if I just briefly recap, so Van Dyck spent most of his career sort of travelling around Europe doing various commissions for different people, and then in about the early 1630s he was invited to England by Charles I, and what the king actually did was he didn't just sort of commission him to do a few works. He actually gave Van Dyck like a permanent residence and a studio for him to live and stay at, and and he would sort of pay him like an actual salary, and Van Dyck would then do all these works for Charles at his court, and obviously he also did some other works for various different important notable people, and so I think that's quite a especially an archetypal type of the patron-client relationship, especially when it comes to the art world, and especially in the early modern era. Is there anything you want to add to expand on that at all, Mr. D? Or
Well, I would add to that there was, of course, there was also a precedent for this in the figure of Henry VIII, King Henry VIII, who of course had a similar relationship to the painter Hans Holbein. Holbein was, as many people know, was a sort of equivalent of the court painter during a period of Henry VIII's reign, and also was given similar arrangements, painted works on the command of the king, and also painted or drew really many of the courtiers, and we have I think it's sort of wonderful picture of the appearance of all those people in court, because of if it's very similar to Van Dyck, because they were both really superlative preeminent artists of their day, and I think that both Charles and Henry were quite savvy to kind of get the best, and again, subsequently we have very sort of clear visual pictures of all these people from both of those reigns, because of those connections with foreign artists.
no, certainly, thank you. And I mean another in contemporary of Van Dyck's would have been Velasquez in Spain. Yes, a very long career serving Philip IV, and also because I've actually got some images we're going to look at tonight, and I do have a couple from Hans Holbein the Younger, so we'll get into that a bit later. But one thing I've noticed when I've really been looking into this, Mr. D, is just how long the sort of patronage of these very talented artists has actually gone on a lot longer than I thought. And I've also noticed that there's a lot of sort of trends and dare I say, sort of changes in the nature of the patronage, which we'll get into as we go through them. So I'm just going to bring it up now. So with the start of what I would really say is when we're thinking about this idea of the patronage of artists, because a lot of people say that Holbein the Younger, who you mentioned there, is really the first sort of modern sort of court painter. Well, I'd actually argue it goes back a little bit further to the 15th century in Burgundy. And so just to bring up the presentation, so in the 15th century, what ends up happening is the Hundred Years' War is going on, and Jean II of France grants the Duchy of Burgundy as an appanage to one of his younger sons. called Philip, known as Philip the Bold, and Philip's sort of junior branch of the House of Valois would go on to be one of the premier powers in Western Europe, effectively being almost virtually autonomous from the French crown because of the amount of wealth and resources they were able to accumulate. And their power really culminates when you get to the third Duke, Philip the Good, who I've got pictured here. And Philip was a very generous patron of what is known as the Northern Renaissance, so where most people are familiar with the Italian Renaissance in places such as Florence, Milan, and Venice. There was also a Renaissance going up in Northern Europe and around the Low Countries, what's now Belgium and the Netherlands. And the Dukes of Burgundy are actually able to acquire through dynastic inheritance most of the Low Countries, and especially reaches its zenith under Philip here. So there's really two artists that are associated with Philip's reign. They are Jan van Eyck, which is the early reign, because Philip ruled from 1419 until 1467, so 48 years, which is a very long time for the medieval period. So Van Eyck dies in 1441, and then after Van Eyck dies, then the new sort of prominent court artist is Roger van der Weyden, who actually painted this portrait of Philip, which we're looking at. And so Philip was obviously someone who was very conscious of prestige and the power of his court. It's also important to remember here that he's a duke and not a king, and so obviously kings are always expected to have the greatest grandeur and splendor. And I think, bearing that in mind, he was even believed to have had ambitions for his own crown himself, because not only was he a subject of the King of France, he was also a subject of the Holy Roman Empire through his possessions in the Low Countries. And so just looking at this painting, one example is, you can see he's actually got this necklace around his neck. So this is called a fire steel, and it's dedicated to a knightly order he set up called the Order of the Golden Fleece, which is one of the most prominent, famous of these heraldic chivalric orders in Europe, because later the Habsburgs would actually take over the patronage of the order, and you actually notice in some Habsburg portraits that they're still wearing the Order of the Golden Fleece. And so is there anything you want to add? How familiar are you with the work of Jan Eyck and van der Weyden, Mr. D?
I am somewhat familiar, yes, of course. Certainly of the Van Eycks, but yes. I would say the Order of the Golden Fleece was a bit similar to the Order of the Garter in Britain.
Yes, no, certainly, because it's a heraldic knightly order. And because just to add a little bit more onto that, because I said that I believe that the beginnings of this sort of early modern patronage really goes back to the Burgundian court. Well, there's a position that is sort of an innovation of the Burgundian dukes, which is the idea of their valet de chambre. In French, literally means the servant of the chamber. So this is a sort of a title that's given to an artist or an artisan, because before you sort of had specialized artists, you would have these artisanal figures which were sometimes expected to be multi-talented, so not just be able to paint a picture, you also are able to design like an architectural monument, for example, or even in some cases be able to complete some carpentry work. So for example, I mentioned Philip the Bold, who was Philip the Good's grandfather. He commissioned a sort of a grand monastery and lots of religious art, and he's the one who starts using this concept. First employs a valet de chambre, and so both Jan Eyck and van der Weyden were employed into this position. And so here I've got another portrait, the portrait of a man, which is one of the best known of Van Eyck's work, and it's actually believed that this is supposed to be a self-portrait, from what I've read. And there's also many other works of his. One of his other most famous works is he did a beautifully a sort of a gaunt altarpiece, which is a very richly gilded and painted altarpiece that's found in Gand, which is now in Belgium. So you said you're somewhat familiar with Van Eyck, Mr. D.
Yes. Yes, I mean, obviously, I think people would be familiar certainly with this portrait, which is in the National Gallery, if I'm not mistaken. It's as you've noted, I mean, it may be a self-portrait. That is, there is some speculation about that, but certainly, I mean, you can see the absolutely virtuosic handling. One of the reasons that I was interested in Jan van Eyck and his brother is, of course, that there is, to some degree, a kind of mystery about why the use of certain pigments have held up so well over the centuries, especially certain pigments which are very sort of was sort of very difficult at the time. For instance, green pigments. So at the time, the only bright, clear green pigments were copper. They were based on copper salts, copper compounds. There was one called copper resonate, which was basically sort of dyeing a tree resin with a copper compound. But the problem with copper is that it's quite reactive, and people may be familiar by walking through various museums that often, particularly old works of landscape, they appear rather brown. They're generally, a lot of them are not so vibrant. They don't have the vibrant green that we would associate with this sort of natural landscape. And one of the reasons for that, it's not so much an artistic choice, but it's because of the fugitive nature of these green pigments. It really wasn't until the 19th century that we had other green pigments, through the sort of development of industrial chemistry, that we had we got all these new colors. So, but the mystery about the Van Eycks is, for instance, if another one of their very famous pictures, which is called the Arnolfini betrothal, or the Arnolfini
Oh,
wedding portrait.
oh yes, I'm familiar with that one. And what I like about that painting is there's like a mirror in the back of the painting which reflects the room back onto the viewer if you look closely.
Yeah, and the back of the figures, and of course, yeah, and of course the Van Eyck's signature is on the wall above that mirror. But if you look at that painting, the green of the bride, she's wearing a green sort of dress or mantle or robe, and it is absolutely, a beautiful, deep green, mossy green, and of course, no hint of discoloration of browning whatsoever. And so, and in a number of the Van Eyck paintings, there's another one which is a fragment of an altarpiece uh, that's in Washington, I believe.
Oh,
And
is it this one?
uh,
I think it's this one, the
the
Annunciation.
Annunciation, yeah, it's that one. And if you look, of course, look at the rainbow color of the wings of the Angel of the Annunciation. Of course, you have all of those colors there in all of their blazing glory, and this was absolutely unusual and unheard of. Generally, if you look at even at much later paintings, I mean, for instance, there's a portrait of George Washington called the Rainbow Portrait, and there's one of actually Queen Elizabeth I called the Rainbow Portrait, which both depict, again, rainbows, but you will see they're very faded and attenuated, and the colors, again, do not have this vibrancy. So this is one of the mysteries, and one of the reasons I was so interested in the Van Eycks is what technical means did they employ that allowed these pigments to remain steady over all these years. So yeah, I mean, that is my particular area of interest, and of course, just the deep, absolute deep, rich coloration, and the beauty of the handling of the details, patterns, and colors is certainly, it certainly recommends their work. By the way, the theory of why the pigments have withstood the test of time is that they may have developed a method of coating the pigment particles with a protein. In other words, what they would do is they would take the pigment, they would grind the pigment, instead of grinding it with oil, which is what you would do, if you're making oil paint. It was first ground with a milk protein called casein, which was often used to make kind of uh, wall paint. It was used it was used often to, to paint interior walls and such. And they would grind it in this casing, and then they would allow it to dry, and then they would grind it again, and then grind it with linseed or walnut oil. And so it was basically this encapsulation by a protein coat, which protected the pigment from the acidic action of the oil. Oil is a much harsher medium for many of these colors. So anyway, that's just an aside, but that's certainly one thing that I've always been fascinated about in relation to Van Eyck's.
Oh no, thank you. And yes, I agree. I love the vibrant colours, especially the bright scarlet, because I don't know if I've mentioned,
Yeah.
but red's actually my favourite colour. And if we just go quickly back to the portrait of a man, your the eye is drawn to the turban because the rest of the painting's quite dark, and so
Yes,
the
and I
eye.
mean, so sort of in fact, there's more articulation of the folds of the cloth in that turban than there is almost anything else in the portrait. It's very interesting to put so much emphasis on on what would be just piece of clothing or a prop. Yeah, and red also a very difficult pigment, because there was really there were two reds that would have been able to be used in, certainly in oil paint, and the major red was called vermilion. It was from it was actually synthesized very early by Arab alchemists, but it's called vermilion or cinnabar in its natural mineral state. It's a mercury pigment, but it is the only bright red, again, in certainly in panel painting and oil painting, until again the 19th century, when we started to get cadmium pigments, things like that. But and then of course the modulation, all that wonderful kind of deep scarlet, was added by using a transparent dye-based pigment, which is called madder, Madder, which is an extract from a plant. And so you would make it basically a dye stuff, and you would then deposit it onto a transparent substrate, and then grind it in pigment, and it would be used to do all the modulation of that red. And so it is amazing. Again, it really two reds in the hands of a capable master, can have infinite sort of modulation. So. Sorry for all the technical talk, but
No, it's wonderful. It enriches the discussion. And speaking of red, because am I not mistaken? I think there wasn't it cochineal beetles that were also used to make red pigment as well.
they were, although that dye is not particularly good in oil. That was often used in watercolor, body color, gouache paints, uh, less acidic media, because cochineal is also, it's what's called an indicator, and so the color of it will change depending on the acidity of whatever it's placed in. So it will often turn a kind of sort of dull purple color if it's placed in more basic or more acidic solutions. So that was less used in oil painting, in fact, or almost not at all. But cochineal is still used today as a food coloring. I hate to break it to people that there are certain foods and drinks that are colored with cochineal, which is basically ground up bugs. So.
Yeah, I found that out years ago, and that put me off certain foods that have colouring in them, because I'm like, So yeah, they've been sneaking the boogs into your food for much longer than you thought. So
Perfectly harmless bugs. But
mhm.
and
And
I should also add that that there are. I mean, there's a very famous book which was written slightly before. I think it was perhaps written in the very late 14th century by an Italian painter called Cennino Cennini. And this book, actually, you mentioned the kind of multifaceted role of a court artist, or even a sort of freelance um, artist or painter. that they would be expected not only to do portraits and official, sort of pictures, but they would also do designs for things, for medals, for architecture, for architectural details. They would sometimes be employed, for very what we would think of as menial tasks, like painting furniture and coloring maps and and engravings and such. So there is a book by this artist Giannini called called Il Libro dell'Arte, and it is really it's the primary source for information we have about both the technical and, of course, the kind of tasks that would be expected of an artist of that time. So if people are interested, it's very it's a fascinating book, and again, it's very historically important because it's the only sort of the only sort of thorough document, basically a handbook of techniques for the artist, and so it gives us a lot of insight into how these artists, the Van Eycks and certainly the Italian artists, Holbein and others, how they would have been working. So so yes, and you get an idea again. When you go through the book, there are all sorts of skills that he's passing along, including as I said, the coloration of furniture and the sort of production of as you say, designs and drawings and things. So yes, the life of certainly of an artist, whether you be a court painter or just a kind of practicing artist, you would have a whole range of skills that you could offer. It was not just painting. Remember, even a very esteemed painter, and certainly the Van Eycks and Holbein and such were very highly esteemed and praised in their lifetime, but the role of the artist was still firmly, at least to some degree, rooted in the artisan, craftsman. Um, so it was a slightly different way to look at it. Oh, by the way, I just would read this quote here. This is from uh, Il Libro dell'Arte, the Giannini book, and he gives advice to young painters. He said, "Your life should be arranged just as if you were studying theology or philosophy or other disciplines. That is to say, eating and drinking moderately at least twice a day, electing digestible and wholesome dishes and light wines, saving and sparing your hand, preserving it from such strains as heaving stones, crowbars, and many other things which are bad for your hand, from giving them a chance to weary it. There is another cause which, if you indulge it, can make your hand so unsteady that it will waver more and flutter far more than leaves do in the wind, and this is indulging too much in the company of women." So not only a technical manual, but life advice for the young, for the temptations of the young painter.
Yes, the guide had to be a sensitive young man, as they say.
Indeed.
Indeed, and on this one, this is interesting because you've almost got sort of patronage within patronage. So here, this is a scene where Jean Jacquelin, the kneeling man with the book, so he was a chronicler employed by Philip the Good to translate a work of Dutch, the Chronicles of Hainaut, which is a province in modern Belgium, and so Vauquelin translated it into French. And so here he's presenting it finished to Philip the Good. And here at the court, you've obviously to the Duke's right from our perspective is his young son, who would be the later Duke Charles the Bold. And then you've got many other courtiers around. And you actually see, I mentioned the Order of the Golden Fleece earlier, but you can see that the young Charles and obviously the other courtiers have also got their members, their Golden Fleece and fire steels on. So obviously they're all members, and of course, and so it's almost like here Philip is presenting, I'm interested in the history and legacy of the provinces which I govern, and I want to publicly show my devotion to, and I think it's important, and so hence why he's commemorated it in this painting. And again, you've got the nice bright red on the left. I believe I assume that's a cardinal or some sort of priestly figure, and then you've got a nice bright blue as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is all very high court dress and high fashion. This painting is a very good example of the fact that I mean, this is sort of not a religious subject per se. It's not a painting of the Virgin and Child or any very specific but scene like that. But it was very common to include, I mean, speaking of patronage, to include who would be the donors or the people who had commissioned these paintings or who had paid for them. It's very common to see them depicted in the works themselves. For instance, there's a very famous picture by Jan van Eyck, which shows a canon, I can't remember his name, of the church, who was again one of the people who commissioned the work, and he is included, of course, kneeling in prayer at the feet of the Virgin, and this is very, very common even in sort of medieval pictures, is that often you will get the figure of the patron of the work included in it, and sort of try to translate this to sort of modern age. It would certainly, I think, in a way, seems crass to the modern viewer. Imagine if someone had done a painting of crucifixion, and not that Donald Trump is a great patron of the arts, which he isn't, but imagine if Donald Trump, commissioned a crucifixion for St. Patrick's Cathedral, and of course he was included kneeling in prayer at the foot of the cross. There would be a furore over this. But this was, of course, perfectly normal for hundreds of years in these portraits, and the Van Eyck's work, and certainly many other artists of the time, you will often see these figures, very, very specifically painted, recognizable figures. In some cases, we know their names, and often the work will be titled, so and so. I mean, that painting of the Virgin and Child that I mentioned by Van Eyck is literally called Virgin and Child with canon, whatever his name was, I can't remember. So again, the patronage would be reflected often very explicitly in the work itself. People, they wanted their share of fame, and they also wanted blessings, eternal blessings that would, that they felt would be conferred to them by making it known that they, and out of devotion, and perhaps less noble reasons, that they had commissioned these works. So
No, certainly. And it's interesting there, you talk about the idea of Donald Trump commissioning some religious iconography. Wouldn't it be amazing if he just commissioned, I don't know, like some stained glass of like the Archangel Saint Michael? I think James Lindsay's head would probably explode.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, one of the very few works of art that he owns is a portrait of himself golfing, so, which people have certainly seen. So
amazing. Okay, so now we move on from Northern Europe, and now I want to talk a little bit about the Italian Renaissance, specifically the Renaissance in Tuscany, and the Medici family, because the Medici family were famously known as the Lords of Florence, and they were bankers by trade. So obviously they're very, very much in the monetary business. But despite being bankers, they were obviously very interested in arts and patronage. And yes, they weren't just lowly bean counters, if we borrow the Carlyleism there. And specifically Lorenzo, I think you really get the height of this sort of patronage in Florence, because at the time you've got Leonardo da Vinci's in his early career, you've got Botticelli, you've got Buchello's around as well, and also I think you'll see the very, very beginnings of Michelangelo's career too. So, and what's also interesting with Lorenzo is he didn't really commission that many works himself, but due to his power and influence, he knew a lot of other people, and many of the other Medici or other notables within Florence would often commission artists on Lorenzo's recommendation. So here is one by Botticelli, which is his rendition of the Adoration of the Magi. So this is a biblical scene of the three wise men or the kings presenting their gifts to the baby Jesus, and so this is quite a common scene you see in art, especially around the time of the Renaissance. Da Vinci himself also had his own version of the Adoration of the Magi, one of his first works. And what's interesting with this one, because you mentioned about patrons often appearing in the artwork. Well, a couple of figures here are actually members of the Medici family, and in fact, if on the left you see there's a man next to a horse, well, that's actually young Lorenzo there, and there's a couple of the Medicis as well. And also, if you look on the right, the fellow in the kind of yellowy golden robe who's looking at you, that's a Botticelli self-portrait that he's inserted in there as well. So, any comments on this one, Mr. D? Or
none specifically, Dave. Yeah, this is something that, of course, accelerated, during the Italian Renaissance. Is that as I said, the artist was still, certainly in the early period, was still firmly rooted in the idea of being an artisan, and of course that designation faded away. Certainly by the time you get to sort of superstardom of the Stuarts, Van Dyck was certainly not painting furniture, but it still remained. But you see hints that the stature of the artist had begun to be elevated to some degree, because you see these self inserts, by artists such as Botticelli, or and then famously reaching a kind of culmination with the so-called School of Athens, which is a painting in the Vatican apartments, which was done by Raphael, and which includes not only a self-portrait, self-insert, but also, of course, it's populated by representations of various artists and thinkers and writers and such. I mean, the figure of Michelangelo and Leonardo are all included there. So yeah, I mean, the relative importance of these artistic figures was certainly rising to the, and only when you were a kind of taken under the wing of the Medicis, or the Borgias, or whoever, could you be so bold as to actually put yourself in the picture. So yeah, I like that.
Yeah, it's interesting because if we think about it, we're talking about patron-client relationships. Well, the oldest example I can think of is in ancient Rome, where you would often have patrons and clients. And I remember reading epigrams by Martial, and there's one of them where he's moaning, and it's like, Titus, why would you have me up at the crack of dawn to follow after you? And so, at that time, Martial is a bit of a sensitive young man. He needs money and patronage to live, and Titus man is like, okay, I'll patronize you, but you've got to follow me around like a minion, and so that was the kind of the situation, isn't it? Yes, you get this money to earn a living, but you have to demean yourself somewhat. And it's interesting that we're getting now to the Renaissance, and artists are now starting to become famous enough that they could kind of do these self-inserts. It's almost like, dare I say, the rise of the modern celebrity culture in perhaps very, very early form.
Absolutely.
Okay, and obviously Botticelli's most famous one, which is the Birth of Venus, and what's really interesting, because this is found in the Uiti Gallery, which is in Florence, because that's another wonderful example of the Medici family's patronage, because not long after Lorenzo died, the Medici were actually driven out of Florence for a time, and because of the tumultuous nature of early modern Italy and the Italian wars, there was a lot of chaos around that time. And after the end of the Italian wars in around the 1530s, the Medici were reinstated, but this time as the Grand Dukes of Tuscany. So a much more greater elevated position. Now they're ruling the whole area and not just Florence. And with the sort of new wealth and power, they commissioned this new gallery in Florence called the Uffizi, and many of famous Italian Renaissance works from Florence are in the Uffizi. So you've got the Birth of Venus is there. I think the one we just discussed, the Botticelli's Adoration of the Magi, is there as well. Yeah, and so anything you want to say on the Birth of Venus at all, Mr. D? Or
No, I mean certainly a personal anecdote is I have a very old print of this, and when I say old, I mean it's from the 19th century, but which was apparently part of the sort of a state of an artist. So it's very interesting, of course, that if you were an artist who had had prints and who admired these great works, you would often only be able to sort of see them in monochrome. But yeah, I have a very old print in its frame of this picture, but as I said, in black and white, which hangs which hangs in my house. So yeah, I'm very fond of this. I'm very fond of Botticelli again, because it's almost I would say his work is a kind of almost a strain unto itself. We sort of think about the kind of precision, the mathematical precision, and the emphasis on correct proportion with an artist such as Leonardo. But Botticelli, I think, comes from slightly more allegorical, a more kind of mannerist, attenuated idea of rendering the human figure and using the human figure, in ways that are, I would say, slightly looser. I certainly admire them, and this picture, I mean, there's one of those. It's one of those images that is, that is so famous that it kind of has its own cultural life, quite apart from its status or its history. So, but yes, I'm very fond of Botticelli in general, and certainly this picture.
Well, it's interesting because in terms of subject matter, thus far we've mostly looked at works that have either covered, obviously the other one, the Adoration of the Magi, is a biblical scene. We've had the Annunciation by Van Eyck, which is another religious themed one, and then all the others have kind of been, either sort of self-portrait and if supposedly of portrait of a man, or it's court art like a portrait. This is the first one that's deliberately classically inspired, because obviously it's of the Roman goddess
Yeah,
of love, Venus, and obviously at the time of the Renaissance, you've got largely, if you go back to the 14th century, the beginnings of it is really with Petrarch and a lot of his writings, because he really wanted to, we must return with a V to Rome and to Greece, and then from there, so we see this real rediscovery and interest in a lot of
yeah.
classical civilization, and ultimately that's, you obviously see that influence culminating in one of the most famous paintings of the Renaissance is the Birth of Venus. So
Yes, and certainly this was the original. This was the origin of the return with a V meme. That people are so fond of now, because I mean, that's why it sort of was later referred to as the Renaissance, the rebirth. Again, rebirth of these classical of classical knowledge and appreciation for classical forms. And of course, it to paint a purely pagan subject like this, would not have been a terribly popular thing to do just 100 years or so before this painting. So yeah, it was certainly it was an expansion into a whole new realm of subjects to be explored by artists and influences. Again, moving from purely medieval influences to, again, artists being influenced by classical ideas of composition and subject and such. So um, and then of course of course, having these classical ideas be sort of reintegrated into the kind of particular Christian iconography, that it was both classicizing in the sense of this sort of revival and interest in classical subjects, but also applying the sort of principles of ancient art and ancient ideas to to the subjects of Christian Europe. So
mm, it's interesting because I remember reading to kind of the West, and Spengler is quite critical of the Renaissance because he sees it as a bit of a LARP. I've now had more time to really think about it. I'm not sure if I quite agree. I still think the Italians were still quite respectful to the classical civilization, where when you get to something like Philhellenism or neoclassicism in the early 19th century. I think that got a bit cartoonish, to be honest. So,
Well, and this is certainly this is certainly a criticism, and I've read. Unfortunately I cannot give you the names of specific authors, but there is a canon of thought that that classicism itself, that the sort of tenets of the Renaissance ruined the native cultures of so many Europeans. In other words, that it was this sort of external influence that sort of came in and stylistically sort of all of again people think of the medieval age in terms of art and culture as being quite primitive, but in a way some of these now of course they a lot of what we consider European medieval tradition came from Byzantium and such, and there were also those influences going on. But the idea that, of course, this wave of mania for all things Roman, all things Greek, it sort of pushed out, sort of more local developments, and particularly this comes up with architecture. I mean, a lot of so-called trad people think of Britain, and they when they think of returning to tradition, they think of returning to neoclassical 18th century Palladianism, neoclassicism, all of that. But when, of course, there was a whole very eclectic native style, and you think of I mean, there's a British an English architect called Robert Smithson, and then of course you think of timber frame buildings, you think of some of the we don't have a lot of examples of it, it doesn't survive, but if you think of some of the mannerist and grotesquerie going on during the reign of Henry VIII, if you think of Nonsuch Palace and such. I mean, these were all kind of forms of architecture that were swept away with the kind of advent of classicism as a new fad. So I certainly see the point that Spengler was making. In a sense, you have you even certainly you get into the 18th century, and you have you have Burlingtonians like wearing togas and sitting in creepy chairs, and it did get a bit much. No, I think there is certainly something to that of all the wonderful things that these re-innovations have given to us. That there also may be an argument to say that certain traditions were taken away by an overemphasis on this.
oh no, thank you for that, Mr. D. And just need to address a comment in the chat. Matt Hopper, I want to see a D stream on Edwardian artist occultist Austin Osman Spare. I have no idea who that is. Have you heard of Austin Osman Spare, Mr. D?
I certainly have, and that's certainly a subject for another day. But a very interesting fellow. Yes.
May have to look him up now.
Yeah. No. Certainly do. Yes. Do look him up.
Okay, and so we've got here just an engraving of a certain Andrea Del Verrocchio, and Verrocchio was famous because he actually ran a artist guild and workshop in Florence, and it was actually at Verrocchio's workshop that Leonardo da Vinci was first apprenticed as a young artist. So here there's a patronage, not necessarily sort of commissioning an artist's work, but rather the training up and the education of an up and coming artist in order to give them the skills and the appropriate workspace in order to learn to perform. And obviously it shows you the many different ways that why patronage is important, and the different ways it can manifest itself. Are you that familiar with Verrocchio at all, Mr. D? Or
I'm familiar with him certainly to the extent of his association with young Leonardo. Also, I believe Perugino was a pupil of his. As far as I recall, there are not many works. There are not many existing works that can really be firmly attributed to him. That there isn't a lot, and of course, I think the great interest in him is not so much in his in his work in its own right, but the fact, of course, that he had such famous pupils, and especially in the figure of Leonardo. And so I think a lot of interest in it is sort of to see which works could possibly contain the hand of young Leonardo as a as a apprentice to Verrocchio. So I don't know a lot about him, as I said, as an artist in his own right, just his association with his more famous pupils.
Yes, because I remember
I think there's
reading.
a few pictures. I think there's a few pictures and perhaps like some sculpture that is that is is that is known to his hand. But yeah, you would certainly probably be be best to talk about him.
Mm. Well, because one thing I do know from what I read years ago is that with a lot of these workshops, the more senior, experienced artists would sometimes do the bulk of a painting, and what they might then do is get a younger apprentice to then come over and like do a little bit, like, oh, just do that corner, or paint that bit of the painting, just so they get some experience. But if they made a mistake, it wouldn't like ruin the whole work, for example. So.
Well, it could be redone. Yes, I mean, if people are not familiar with what being apprentice to an artist's workshop period. I mean, you were not just learning how to paint, but you're also working. I mean, so the apprentices would be they would do, as I said, the grinding of the pigments. Of course, because there weren't. I mean, for many of these artists, there weren't colormen as we think of, Winsor Newton and Rowney and the kind of colormen of the 18th and 19th century that sort of cropped up as a business. That the very limited sort of resources where you could go and buy, and generally you would buy pigment from importers and sellers of such thing. But to make it up into paint, of course, would be done in your workshop, and that was something for the apprentices to do. They would make up paint, they would prepare surfaces, they would model, they would handle sort of all of the kind of I want to say menial tasks. They're very important tasks, but and in addition, as you say, they would also work on these paintings, and depending upon the extent of the commission, certainly if it's a very large altarpiece or a very complex work, they would often do quite a lot of the picture. They would often be employed. It was these tasks were sort of meted out by skill. So if there was someone who was particularly good at foliage on trees, then that was what they would do. You would have, you would get it. You would get one who would do the skies and do the clouds, and generally the master would work on the faces and the figures, the important figures in the painting. But it's quite surprising to the extent to which many other parts of the picture would be left up to the pupils, and of course in the case of I mean you get to Anthony van Dyck and some of his later paintings, there is almost no evidence that he touched them at all. That they're entirely the product of the workshop, and even in early periods, that we're talking about in Italy, you know, a lesser commission again may barely have been worked on by the master at all. And you'll often see, if you go through art museums, you'll see workshop of so and so, because it's fairly identifiable. I mean, the only picture that I know of Verrocchio is of course, you may have it, is called the Baptism of Christ, and again the reason I know it is that the two kneeling angel figures beside Christ in that painting are thought to be largely the work of young Leonardo, and you can tell that there's a different hand going on. Even though of course the pupils would try to emulate the style of their master, but often you will. It's quite obvious which parts were done by whom. So yeah, I mean, this was these were businesses. I mean, it was not just a singular artist working alone in the studio. These were in the fullest sense workshops where there were, and depending on how big the workshop was, there would be many, sometimes very many young apprentices working away at these tasks. So yeah, it's something very important to remember about art of these earlier periods.
Mm. Yeah, because it's interesting because obviously when we looked at the Burgundian examples, it's pretty much the Duke is directly patronising these artists, and they're mostly working for the Duke's court. Whereas here in Florence, it seems a lot more business like. The workshop is a business and has to get all these commissions in order to operate. So certainly a more commercialised operation.
Yes, and of course, to sort of keep up with demand, the sort of very popular artists would have required this work. The other thing about this painting I'm reminded of is that there was an artist and a historian called Vasari, who I'm sure you know, people
Oh yes,
may
the
know,
lives of painters. Yeah.
lives of the painters, lives of the artists, and he was also a um, he was also an artist, artist himself, and an architect, and otherwise. But I believe that there's a story that Vasari tells in Lives of the Painters that Verrocchio gave up being an artist because he was so overawed by the talent of his young pupil, which is probably not true at all. I cannot imagine that actually happening. But again, such as the kind of even early myth making about some of these great figures.
No,
So
it's an interesting anecdote, but yeah, it's probably not true. Um, I do have one painting here from Leonardo's early career from his time in Florence, because most of his most famous works were actually after he left Florence. So they're from his Milanese period under the Duke of Milan, or from the time when he was patronised by the Borgias, or Francis I of France. But this early one is from Ginevra de Benci, and it's obviously just a portrait of a noblewoman, and obviously that's a recurring motif because you've got the Mona Lisa, you've got the lady with an ermine, so obviously it's a recurring thing that comes up in his work, and yeah, I think this is a pretty decent early painting of his.
yes, and I've certainly seen this and looked at it up close. It is also in the National Gallery of Washington, and it's small. It's quite a small picture. Uh, Also, I think this is a very good. It's very good that you brought this up because remember earlier I was talking about how green pigments often became discolored. This is a prime example. So if you see all of that foliage behind her, that would have all been bright green at one point, and this is the kind of browning associated with the discoloration of copper, of copper containing pigments. So yeah, so a work that looks quite different than it looked when it was freshly painted. The other interesting thing about this work is, if you're interested in having an extraordinarily up close view, I believe that on what is it called? Is it called Google Art Project? There is an ultra high resolution version of this picture. I mean, you can look at it in almost microscopic detail. So if people are interested in getting a very close look at Leonardo's technique, and certainly in an early picture, yeah, if you just look for it, there is an ultra HD version of this available on the web. So
Well, I would think the painting's got quite good sort of resolution and quality, so that'd be very interesting to looking at it even closer. So, right. Okay, so now we come to Hans Holbein, and it's really interesting looking really at him up, Mr. D, because before he was patronised by Henry VIII, he was actually patronised by many other notable people in England. So his first patron was actually Sir Thomas More, who I've got pictured here, who Holbein did a painting of, and it's interesting because after Thomas More sadly was executed, he then went on to work for Anne Boleyn and Thomas Cromwell as well, and he did their portraits.
yeah, I mean and in fact, I his there are no his portrait of Anne Boleyn no longer exists. So it's sort of very interesting kind of omission, because so many of these other figures like Anne of Cleves and Catherine Howard and other figures and Thomas More in Henry VIII's during Henry VIII's reign, we have these very clear sort of pictures. But the only picture we have, contemporary picture we have of Anne Boleyn, or one of the only ones, is a much poorer representation by a different artist. But yeah, I mean, this picture, of course, is an absolutely glorious one. This picture is in New York at in a collection called the Frick Collection, and Henry Clay Frick was a 19th century sort of industrialist. I can't remember the industry, but he was a great collector of much amazing art, including, of course, this very famous portrait. Holbein also painted figures from the kind of continental, or as you say, the Northern Renaissance. That he did quite a number of drawings and paintings of Erasmus of Rotterdam, which also helped to establish and spread his fame, as the preeminent portraitist of certainly of the day, of the places where he worked. So.
No, certainly, and it's also interesting because obviously Sir Thomas More was not so much an aristocrat or a ruler. He was obviously a politician. He was the chief minister of Henry VIII for a few years, and so so it's interesting. You're sort of seeing how, being an artist at court, he sort of climbed his way. He went from Thomas More, then when More fell out of favour and was killed, he then went to Anne Boleyn. From Anne Boleyn, got to the king himself. So it's sort of an interesting way to sort of spread your influence and renown as an artist. And because you mentioned Erasmus of Rotterdam, yes, I have seen that painting, and it's interesting because Erasmus was a humanist, and obviously, what's humanism mean? Well, it's this. It's very much associated with a lot of Catholic thinkers, really pre-Reformation. We should try to understand, the source of knowledge and human experience. We need to properly study, history, geography, and gain more knowledge about the world. And that comes up a lot in the next painting, where we've got Holbein the Youngest, most famous one, which is the ambassadors. And there's so much things we can talk about on this one, because the ambassadors, the ambassadors themselves are two ambassadors from the French court to Henry VIII's courts that have been
Jean d'Antville and Georges de Selve, I believe, are their names. I know this because, of course, this is a favorite picture of mine. Just before you go on, very interestingly, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, there is another portrait of these same men, but by a different artist in a very different context, actually placed in a classical context. I can't remember. I think there's a big snake in that picture as well. But very interesting that, of course, there are other sort of portraits of these men that exist from other hands. So if people are interested in a sort of comparison, you can look that up. And you just go to the Met Museum's website and just look up de Selve and d'Antville.
Thank you, because when I was reading, this was actually commissioned by Anne Boleyn as a gift to d'Antville, and so I thought quite a flattering one. And it's interesting if you look at all the motley of objects on the shelves there. So you've got a lute, you've got some books. There's a normal globe, but then there's like an astrolabe at the top. I think that is. So it's sort of like a navigational globe, and then there's I think there's a sundial there as well, and looks like some sort of measuring equipment. So again, all of this is, it's the age of discovery. The world is much bigger than we first thought, and you need to go out there and explore it and learn more about it. And again, leaning back into the rise of sort of humanism at this time. And obviously, if anybody's not seen this painting before, your eyes might be drawn to the rather haunting image at the bottom here. You've got a skull that is been superimposed onto the bottom, and it's done at a blink angle, and that if you look, if you angle your head sort of the top right, you can kind of see the skull properly. Also, from what I've seen, is if you get like a glass tube and you hold it up, it also shows you properly that way as well.
Yeah, and I believe if people are curious, you can. There is a digitally, sort of version where you can the skull is put into its normal proportions. I think even on the Wikipedia article about this painting, the weird thing about this is in the National Gallery in London, and the other weird thing about this is if you're in the presence of the painting and you stand in the right place, of course, the skull resolves itself into a normal skull. So if you stand at a very oblique angle at the to the right side of this picture, as if you were walking by it, there is a point where you will see the skull normally, which is very weird. It's a very weird experience, and certainly quite a novel addition. It's almost unprecedented for pictures like this. I mean, this was a very early example of what became known as a vanitas picture. And that became a very popular subject. We think of many of them in the 17th century in the Low Countries and Netherlandish painting. But these were paintings which generally showed objects having to deal with the idea of earthly vanity, objects associated with wealth and luxury and power, but also interspersed with objects which alluded, sort of allegorically alluded to the idea, of course, that life was fleeting and that death was ever present, and of course that in the midst of your luxury and wealth, that you should also be mindful, of course, of your and prepare for your own death. And so you would often see these pictures with, I mean, very obviously with skulls and bones littered around, but also things like, there would be a candle which had just been snuffed out, and there's sort of the last glowing ember on the wick is there, and the smoke is rising. Or there will be soap bubbles floating around. Again, a bubble is this sort of beautiful object which has a very transitory existence, which is going to pop. And tobacco again. There'll often be smoking pipes and packets of tobacco. Again, up in smoke. This momentary pleasure that goes up in smoke and leaves only ashes behind. So, but this painting, of course, is a kind of prototype of that. All those objects you mentioned, these are objects of learning. These are objects of worldly power, which allude to the sort of burgeoning ages of empire, exploration, mathematical learning, and also luxury. I mean, the extraordinary rendering of the furs and voided velvets and slash sleeves and jewels and gold and shining surfaces and luxurious fabrics. Again, all of this is sort of collapsed in the central figure of this oblique skull. Again, reminding you that out of all this glory, the end is the ignominy of death, and of course the facing of your final judgment. So yeah, I mean, it was a very interesting type of picture, very interesting type of picture to make. But of course, it also kind of, I think these vanitas pictures also point at the kind of hypocrisy of this, because they are also popular because, of course, the sumptuousness and the expense of having a great artist do a very careful painting, showing all the kind of glories of texture and color and such. So in a way, the painting itself is also an indictment of kind of faithlessness, of getting lost in vanity of vanities. All is vanity. So yeah, a very, very, very interesting picture, and one which I've always loved.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. D. And yes, I think the term that comes to mind about the skull is memento mori, remember you will die. And
Yeah.
it's and also because it's very much, to me, seems like a very medieval motif, because in the medieval period they're obsessed with death, and our life on earth is short, so we must pray to for our life in the next, and that seems like a very call back to the older medieval periods. And despite all these new innovations and luxury and wealth, and remember, we'll still die at the end of the day. And Another little detail about his painting I did not notice before Mr. D until I looked at it before we went live is that in the top left-hand corner there was a crucifix that's slightly hidden behind the curtain.
Yes. Yep. Peeping out. Yeah, peeping out. Yeah, it's very, very, very easy to miss that. Yeah.
There's this sort of interesting.
Again,
It's
well,
almost
who
like
is the man? Who is the man behind the curtain? Indeed.
Well, I'm more thinking of that perhaps he's implying, religion is being forgotten about. It's behind the curtain. We're more concerned about all these worldly pursuits now.
Yeah, so I think that's part of that implication there. Yes.
Yeah. So just to extrapolate on this a bit more, because with all the Burgundian art we talked about earlier, what brought my attention to that was earlier this year I was sort of flicking through because I like to buy lots of books and flick through them from time to time, and a book I was interested in, which I've not got around to really reading through properly, but I had a bit of a glance through it, was the book The Autumn of the Middle Ages by the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga. And the reason I was interested in reading that is because it's kind of seen as one of these books that's all about sort of decline essentially, and it's all about how in Huizinga's view, we talk about the Northern Renaissance, and the Renaissance is this idea of optimism, vitality. We're rediscovering all these great sort of knowledge and secrets of ancient Rome and Greece. It's a great, wonderful time to be alive. And the Autumn of the Middle Ages is a little bit interesting because it's sort of like saying, well, Huizinga saying, well, this Renaissance, we shouldn't see it as a new age. We should see it as the end of an old one. And he sort of comments a lot on what he saw was sort of the decline of the society. So he talks about how with a lot of these paintings, like the Arnolfini painting, the art does seem to be a little bit stiff in some ways. And he also talks about how there seems to be this, the nobility are withdrawing into their own private domains away from the common people or the wider society. And it's almost like they're trying to insulate themselves from the horrors of the world outside. And so on some level, he sort of has this sort of interesting counterpoint that perhaps the Renaissance is not all what it's cracked up to be.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I've not read the book. I'm not familiar with it, but yeah, I mean that's certainly a lot to be explored about that. I mean, yes, there were other reasons for this sort of great social change that came from the top down during these periods, and it is interesting, though, of course, how some of these ideas, in a sense, with the dawn of the very early days of the so-called Renaissance, again, which is the whole concept of the Renaissance as a kind of cohesive historical moment is a revision from later on, of course. But it is interesting how it also coincides to some degree with the Reformation, and with the rise of Protestantism and the fall of Catholicism, certainly in England, which is was certainly a colored this whole era. But then, of course, how some of these sort of ideas, and you mentioned the kind of almost sort of medieval flavor of the memento mori or the vanitas image, and that persisted, and it became very popular, as I said, even into the 17th century. So certainly ideas to be explored.
And one other idea is need to remember that this is the post-Machiavellian age. So obviously the ideas of Machiavelli, it's greater to be feared than loved, and a very cynical view of the world, rejecting older, higher ideas of chivalry or piety. So again, alluded back to the crucifix hiding behind the curtain. It's almost like we're doing away with all those old ideas. We're now practical modern men.
Yeah, indeed. But of course, these anxieties still lurk. By the way, I don't know if it's possible for you to pull it out. I DM'd you just quick and dirty. I did the perspectival shift of the whole picture, so you can sort of see the effect of what it looks like when you stand at the very edge of the picture and look at it obliquely. I don't know if it's possible to show that. It's a bit awkward, the size of the image, but But you could see in that how weird it actually is. Yeah, I don't know. It's very difficult to say because it's so small. But yeah, you see you can see, and that is what it looks like when you see it in person. When you stand at the edge of the picture in person. Um, the skull exists in a sort of different dimension, which is just a very curious visual trick.
It's just there haunting you.
Indeed, and to be seen again, to be seen at a glance, to be seen out of the corner of the eye, it's quite quite moving and quite eerie, in a way.
Okay, so now we come to a painting I like very much, and another example of patronage. So this is an artwork called Vertumnus by an artist probably most of the audience have never heard of, called Giuseppe Arcimboldo. So he was an Italian painter, and he was patronized by the Habsburgs, the three Holy Roman Emperors, Ferdinand I, Maximilian II, and most famously Rudolph II. And Rudolph II had his court actually at Prague rather than Vienna, and Arcimboldo spent most of his career at Prague Castle doing many sort of commissions, and this is his most famous one. So, what this painting is, this is a portrait of Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor, as the Roman god of nature Vertumnus, and it's an absolutely wonderful work of art. He's made him out of all of these different sort of fruits and vegetables, and I think we could say it's probably one of the earliest examples of what you could possibly say is a sort of a pseudo surrealist artwork.
Yes, a very very early kind of manifestation. I must confess that I really don't like Arcimboldo. I mean, he did many paintings of this nature. Something about them. I just remember being terrified because I very early I had books about sort of art monographs about various periods of time. I just remember as a child just being absolutely freaked out by these. So I don't think I've ever I don't think I've ever overcome that feeling. But they are very curious. They are certainly very curious works of art for their time. And you could certainly look at I mean, there are particular works by a figure like Salvador Dali, obviously sort of kind of picking up these strains of, if not surrealism, certainly extreme mannerism, uh, from so long
Um,
ago.
I mean, if there's one thing we can give Arcimboldo, I think he was at least cutting edge and innovative.
Oh yes, I mean, there was little like him, certainly in the kind of. I mean, there were things not necessarily of this exact nature, but I mean, there was a sort of strain. I mentioned, the idea of the grotesque. I mean, literally, the word grotesque comes from the word grotto. The sort of motifs of the grotto, which is another thing that sort of a sort of revived interest in the later part of the Italian Renaissance and Northern Renaissance. But and so some of the weirder things, that we associate with a kind of post Renaissance movements like mannerism, and there are a lot of weird things going on. As I said, not as much in large kind of panel painting or canvas painting, but there are a lot of, if you look at a lot of decorative art and sort of decorations of books and frontispiece of various books, and also of course architectural decorations stuff, that there are some weird things that you can find that I can only associate, sort of loosely with a figure like Arcimboldo, but there was a strain of something odd at the time, uh, that I suppose loosely fits into. But yeah, I mean, you if nothing else, it's certainly was a unique manifestation. And of course, doing this as an artist who has very important patron. I don't know what do you think Lorenzo de Medici would have thought of a portrait of himself done in this manner. I think it would be received in a different way.
Well, we've got to remember this is obviously late 16th century, so we're really deep into the the early modern era now, and we talk about a classical subject. Well, you've literally got the Holy Roman Emperor portrayed as a classical god, so we're really going down the classical rabbit hole with this one.
Yes, but I don't know, just something like, here, sire, is a portrait I've done of you as a mess of vegetables.
Well, the thing is, Rudolph II loved this painting. He absolutely loved it.
Interesting.
It was one of
Well,
and
there was among some people a great mania for kind of curiosities of this nature. I will give an example from Britain. I mean, again, if there are some very small fragments of some of the interior decoration from Hampton Court Palace that survive, that were discovered much later on. I mean, as I said, that very little from certainly of that ephemeral nature survives. But if you look at I would say that sort of the absolute weirdness and boldness of some of that. Again, if you look at sort of images of None Such Palace commissioned by Henry VIII, again, it's like we have this idea of a kind of staid, conservative kind of continuum of British architecture and British, sort of aesthetics. But in a way, it was sort of sanitized, as we mentioned earlier, with the kind of advent of neoclassicism in the 18th and 19th century. But there was some really far out, for lack of a better term, very far out things going on. So there was an appreciation for this kind of novelty during that period of time. So it shouldn't be forgotten. And again, you can more easily see manifestations of this. Like if you look at sort of some of the collections of the so-called Green Vault in Dresden, of these and also things that remain from British medieval and Renaissance silversmiths. Some of the great salts, which are called a nef, which were these extraordinarily, almost some of them had clockwork in them, and they would sort of race across the table, and great mythical beasts. I mean, there are jewels associated with Elizabeth I, which again are these great sort of quasi-Baroque conceptions, using sort of misshapen pearls and very fanciful kind of colorful enameling and such. So yeah, I mean, this is, I think, manifested in this picture. There is an aspect of kind of great novelty that your great patron would have appreciated at the time. So it's a wonderful strain of art history to look into, which I, as you said, I don't think a lot of people are familiar with this kind of thing.
Well, I've actually got a story, Mr. D, because I first learned about this painting in a high school art class, and for the project for the year, the whole class had to paint themselves in this style. I'm not joking.
Wow.
Yeah. And another year we had to do something you'll appreciate. We had to the Picasso painting, the Weeping Widow.
Yeah.
We had to paint ourselves in the style of that one year as well. That was interesting.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, you can see the art teachers like wacky stuff.
Yeah. Well, it's good. It's sort of again, it is the sort of novelty that would easily captivate the mind of certainly younger people. So I mean, I know, for instance, Arcimboldo, a lot of young people are, they quite like, they really like them. They're quite yeah. I mean, again, it's sort of teaching about art. you do look for ways to sort of give things that will captivate people and get them sort of drawn into to these histories. So yeah, it's amusing. It's not a personal favorite, but it's certainly amusing.
And just a comment from Jacob. Was he a seedy fellow, this emperor? No, but he was rather fruity.
Yeah, it's taking the carrot pill a bit too far.
I think he's taken a whole bottle of carrot pills to this emperor.
Mm.
Okay, now we're going to look a little bit at the Dutch Golden Age, and so this is a quite a late Rembrandt, the Syndics of the Drapers Guild. So Drapers Guild ultimately is a guild that specialised in the production and regulation of the cloth trade, and this particular Drapers Guild actually commissioned Rembrandt to do this, and so he's just done a picture of them, and they later hung it in their guild hall. So again, another example of a different kind of patronage. So this time it's like an actual business, and it's very important because obviously the Netherlands and has always historically been a epicenter of the cloth trade. So certainly something very culturally important.
Yeah, yes, indeed, and of course, a very different, as you say, a very different idea of a patron. So we've just a couple of 100 years, we've gone from, of course, great figures of nobility, aristocracy, religious figures, to, of course, the rising new sort of sense of aristocracy, which would be sort of great merchants, great tradesmen, and yes, something very certainly much more naturally for the Dutch, having been really involved in that kind of thing for a very long time. So this picture also, weirdly enough, is another. It's another one of those pictures that has its own life. It sort of developed its own life apart from its own history or its own kind of nature, which is that I believe it was an American company in the 20th century that produced machine-made cigars, and I don't know the name of the company, but the product was called Dutch Masters, and for a very long time they used as the kind of logo for the product this picture, or at least a version of this picture of the Dutch Masters, and of course these were not tobacconists. I don't know why exactly there was this association between this picture and cheap cigars, but yes, and so I think that I don't know, this again, this image would become very well known to men in the 20th century in America because of its association with cigars rather than with Rembrandt or cloth guild or whatever. So a very curious thing.
Interesting. Well, then mayhaps somebody involved was like, Pennsylvania Dutch, so maybe they, because of the cultural ancestry, maybe they were just aware of the painting.
Yeah, yeah, it could be. Who knows? I mean,
Mm.
maybe perhaps just the idea of I don't know, quality, or I have no idea.
We know, well, sadly, cigar companies no longer use, the Dutch Golden Age artwork to promote their products. So decline, decline, decline.
Mm, indeed.
And also got a one by Vermeer, and Vermeer's a very interesting character. Because you talked about this idea of you know, commercial patron. Well, Vermeer himself was actually an art dealer, and so most of his career and life was actually spent trading and selling off various bits of art. And again, another very mercantile subject matter, because you've got this the bartering of again cloth, and also another self-portrait, because the fellow on the left is actually believed to be a self-insert portrait of Vermeer himself. So
Yeah, indeed, and quite a mysterious figure for me, and a subject of a lot of modern fascination. Famously, the British artist David Hockney uh, has a whole theory about Vermeer's technique and use of technical object called a camera obscura. But yes, I mean, it's, very, very rare, the kind of existence of an art dealer who also is a painter in his own right. But
Well, it's interesting because from what I was reading, the painting was just something he did on the side essentially. So like it wasn't even that his main profession, and it really says a lot about someone's art that you're a world-renowned artist, and it's like, oh, it's only a side job.
yeah,
And
and of course, subsequently, there's so few of his pictures left. I believe there's 26, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah, no, not that many. And but it's also interesting because he actually, when he died, his wife was in debt, so it just shows you he wasn't that financially well off, sadly. And I can't help but think that, again, with this shift from the patronage of artists away from these great sort of noble figures to this almost like this art trade, as it were. Now, as an artist, you just have to sell your goods on the market like any businessman, and it's just like the market's merciful.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, indeed.
Okay, so this next one is patronage of a very different nature. So obviously we've got a Death of Marat by Jacques-Louis David, which is one of his most famous paintings. So Jacques-Louis David, for those who don't know, was a late 18th century, early 19th century painter. He's best known for doing a lot of these kind of classical scenes. You've got the salute of the Horatii, or the rape of the Sabine women. But other than that, he also did a lot of art relating to the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, because in his sort of earlier career, he was actually patronized by Maximilien Robespierre, the director of the Committee of Public Safety. And here the subject matter, so Marat, or Jean-Paul Marat, was one of the leading French revolutionaries, and he was fatally stabbed to death while taking a bath by Charlotte Cordray. And so obviously, because Jacques-Louis David, interestingly enough, was given the title Dictator of Art by Robespierre, and so from there he commissioned this artwork in the memory of Marat. And there's just something a little bit I'm going to say sick, for lack of a better word, about this painting, because I take it, Mr. D, you're familiar with the artistic sort of use or concept of the Pieta.
Yeah. Yes.
Because for the audience's benefit, a Pieta is a very common scene you see in a lot of early modern art. It's essentially the representation of the Virgin Mary cradling the dead body of Christ. I think there's a famous Bernini sculpture of it, and there's quite a few paintings.
Well, the most famous, of course, is Michelangelo's Pietà in the Vatican. That I would say that is certainly the most famous representation. But a very common popular subject addressed by a lot of artists.
Well, the reason I bring that up, Mr. T, is there's an expression about this painting. The Death of Marat is described as the Pieta of the French Revolution, and you can see why I think that's a bit sick. Because
absolutely, and of course, Marat and Robespierre be disgusting characters. Marat, particularly. I don't know if you know why he is in the bath.
Yes, he had a very horrific skin condition, so he had to soothe his pain by bathing.
Yeah, I believe it was psoriasis, but he had a chronic weeping pustular skin condition, which he had to sit in the bath and exude his fluids. So just perfectly you could tell my opinion of the French revolutionaries, but it's a perfectly disgusting character. But yes, this painting, of course, gives him a lasting memorial, which he really doesn't deserve. But there you go. And it's a bit weird. This is a bit weird, this painting, for modern people, but that is very much an 18th century, early 19th century bath. That's the form they often took. And they would be lined with sort of linens prior to the bather stepping in. So
so because ultimately the reason I've gone for this is now patrons. It's not just you're an artist who's been commissioned by some lord who wants to raise his prestige or decorate his realm with beautiful art. artwork or even doing it as a business, you're now being commissioned to produce basically sort of revolutionary agitprop as artwork, essentially.
But in a way, of course, this is a continuation of the kind of model of patronage of the arts. That in one way or the other, it was about using someone's great talents, whether they be a painter, a sculptor, a jeweler, an architect, whatever, to give prestige, to give sort of aesthetic greatness. In other words, to sort of decorate and shore up one's own sort of claim to power. Again, whether it be why churchmen and nobility commissioning religious works. But both as a way to sort of as an offering, a spiritual offering, but also as a way to again sort of lend kind of awesome prestige and power to the church, to the ideas of the church, and then of course great rulers. Charles the First, Henry VIII, or even Charles II, Napoleon. All of these figures, in some way, their image, their kind of metaphysical idea of exaltation and greatness is so much dependent upon the arts that were produced for them to present them in a certain light. And I think any smart ruler understands this. They understand the power of imagery, the power of this sort of thing. So yes, and of course, as times change, the priorities change. When in revolutionary France, where we are not interested in the monarchy, we are not interested in the church, and yet, of course, they're still kind of, they were unable to come up with a model that wasn't basically just a repetition of the old model with new terms tacked onto it. So it's very, very interesting, and it continues today. I mean, if you look at an artist like Andy Warhol, who developed a kind of very lucrative part of his career producing portraits of people, and anyone could, of course, be ennobled by Andy Warhol if they had the money to purchase the portrait. And they were all the same size, they were all 40 by 40 inches square, and they were all done with a in a particular style, using a particular process. But again, this is it is a perhaps a kind of degradation of this idea of the artist and the patron both helping each other. But again, it's still part of this same tradition of the idea that the artist, through his particular genius, is able to create an iconography of greatness, but for you, if you have the money or prestige to be able to afford it. So.
No, certainly, but we must remember that Jacques-Louis David was a true believer in the French Revolution. He wasn't just doing it because he was given money. So.
Oh yeah, I mean, of course, you can't be dictator of art without actually believing in that sort of thing. But dear, oh dear,
No, certainly. Well, we've got another one. So this is his famous Napoleon crossing the Alps, and obviously propaganda art if you ever saw one. But I mean, where to even begin with this? Because very famously, when Napoleon crossed the Alps, he actually did it on a mule. So having him riding this valiant steed as his Cape billows, it's almost comically propagandistic. And another detail I will say that's interesting is in the bottom left, you've got obviously Napoleon's name etched into the rock, but you've also got the names of Hannibal and Charlemagne, obviously two other famous conquerors who crossed the Alps into Italy. So again, it's like he's going forth in the steps of former great conquerors.
Yes, and of course, there's a long tradition of the equestrian portrait. I mean, you think back to Van Dyck and Charles the First. The famous equestrian portraits of Charles the First. Again, as sort of giving them a stature. I mean, of course, Napoleon and Charles the First both suffered from a similar affliction, which is they were both quite short. So again, you sort of find ways to kind of present them in the most heroic light possible. But of course, this is an ancient tradition going back to Roman times. Of course, the kind of equestrian portrait figure, equestrian sculpture of a great leader, and this is something that again persists in into fairly modern times. When we have a statue, I mean, assuming there are any statues that haven't been torn down and thrown into a canal left, but there of course we think of our great military leaders and kings presented in an equestrian context, this sort of continuation of this ancient iconography. So yeah, and of course you just sort of suspension of disbelief enough to kind of appreciate this type of image, but
No, certainly. But the thing is, we've declined even from then, Dee, because we don't even have, leaders bestriding stallions anymore. Because now we're just, with someone like George Floyd, you can't have him on a stallion. You just stick his head and tell everybody you must worship the Pieta of modern American racism.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, obviously. I mean, well, to be fair, I have my own sort of pet theory that the advent of kind of technological means of producing figurative sculpture means that almost no one knows how to do it anymore. There are so few, and of course we've seen. I don't know if you've seen that sculpture of the late Queen and Prince Philip that was fairly recently unveiled. I mean, absolutely abysmal, atrocious.
Oh yeah. Oh yes, I remember now. Yeah, that wasn't good.
No, no, but this is a problem, of course, because now, of course, we don't. Again, it becomes this sort of kitsch. We can't imagine a leader depicted as a great man in this way, and possibly because we don't have men who are worthy of this kind of hagiography, of this sort of grand vision, grand ennobled vision of them astride their steed, leaping into greatness and into history. So I think there's both a kind of degradation of the kind of expectations of this iconography, but also a degradation in the ability to produce it, and the degradation in the people who deserve it. We no longer have, and of course not that everyone who received this treatment or in the past always deserved it, but yeah, I mean, I think that of course we even though that this model of patronage and this model of iconography and spectacle still remains, but of course its nature has cheapened along with everything else. It's a sort of condition of modernity.
I'm just thinking, Mr. D, if Donald Trump wins the election next week, perhaps he should make you the dictator of arts of America. Perhaps we could then return to some proper art and patronage.
Yeah, I mean, we need a giant equestrian statue of Donald Trump. I would support that. There are weird sort of anomalies about this. So, for instance, in one of the museums in Washington D.C., there is a 19th century marble sculpture, larger than life, of George Washington, portrayed as Cincinnatus. And I mean, one can see, of course, why this was done. And of course, at the time, that this kind of federal classicism was popular. But it seems it's both interesting, but there's something off about it. It rings hollow, this depiction, because occasionally you can't, you're not in a time, or you're not in a place, the time isn't right for the kind of melding of these various traditions. I mean, George Washington, for all of his great character, it just doesn't look right, in a toga sitting on a throne. So again, occasionally this kind of iconography can also backfire. Now, this was this was made after his, well after his death. So it's not as if it was commissioned. Washington certainly, he did have images made of himself, and again, the artist patron relationship with particularly Gilbert Stuart. Gilbert Stuart, you know, deliberately chosen. He's sort of the Holbein of the American founding fathers, and painted many of them from life, and other artists, John Trumbull and such. But it is very interesting to see that these situations just sort of replicate themselves in different periods, and of course they work, or they don't. I think that of course the Stuart Trumbull sort of legacy of what we think of. I mean, for instance, the portrait of George Washington on the U.S. $1 bill is an adaptation of Gilbert Stuart portrait from life of Washington. So this iconography also, from more recent periods, still has power and still exists, but a very different model of patronage. I'm sorry for that digression, but
Oh no,
I was just
no, no.
reminded of that. I'm always reminded of that strange statue of Washington as Cincinnatus.
Oh no, no, thank you. It's wonderful. It's relevant because it's actually come related to an image that's going to come up shortly. So, okay, so that's all the paintings for this evening. So this last little segment, I want to talk about another form of patronage, which I find quite interesting, which is the Bavarian obsession with with great architecture in the 19th century. So this is an image of the Valhalla Temple. It was commissioned by Ludwig I of Bavaria and designed by his architect Leo von Klenz, and so it was constructed in 1842. And so you obviously see it was modelled on the Parthenon that's in Athens, and it's very strange because obviously with the top name Walhalla, yes, it's named for that Walhalla, the Warriors' Hall in Asgard, the place where the Vikings go when they die. Because what the Valhalla is, it's this neoclassical temple that is dedicated to essentially the German national people and the German greats of the past. So there's many plaques and little and sort of busts of various famous Germans. So there's one in there of Arminius, the defeater of the Romans at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. There's one of Frederick the Great. And then even after this was constructed, many future Germans were added. So there's a bust of Bismarck in there as well. And even recently, in the past few years, one was added of the former West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. And so it's something the Germans are still even adding to as time goes on. But it's just very strange because, again, you've got this building that's dedicated to, this sort of Germanic, the Germanic nation, and yet it's done in this neoclassical style. So I don't know, it just seems a little bit uncanny to me. What do you think, Mr. T?
Yeah, certainly a bit odd. Certainly, certainly crossing, certainly mixed metaphors, so to speak. But you get, I mean, perhaps lesser examples of this, but you're sort of putting Abraham Lincoln in a a Greek/Roman temple. It's certainly a bit strange. I didn't understand the Valhalla thing related to this, but yeah, very very curious, very very curious.
Well, remember, it's the 19th century. You've got Romanticism, and obviously you've got Wagner's
Yeah.
operas, and there's all the rings of Nibelungen, and etc. etc. So,
Well, it's the same sort of time period that gave us like weird. You think of the Egyptian revival sort of things going on in Britain. You get sort of sphinxes and false pyramids and things of that nature. So yes, I mean the 19th century is sort of the great blender of historical illusions.
And yeah, so this is the reason why I said classical sculpture. So this is in the Valhalla itself. So it's a statue of Ludwig I, the patron, in this sort of neoclassical style. And yeah, it just, to me, it just seems very strange that you've got this 19th century German king in like a sort of crown, a wreathed crown, and
Yeah.
the toga.
Yeah, I mean, and very much similar to that statue of George Washington that I mentioned, and probably made around the same time. Yeah, I mean, occasionally this sort of these sort of mixes of iconography they don't entirely work. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
a very odd thing, and of
yeah,
course this kind of thing later became synonymous with postmodern pastiche, which of course perhaps you could say that these some of these 19th century revival impulses were almost kind of pastiche in themselves. I mean, you mentioned Spengler, kind of talking about how this is just sort of the ultimate form of kind of fancy dress. It's all just costumery. Uh,
mm. But you see what I mean, though. Like I can forgive the Renaissance's indulgence in classicism because I didn't think it got too excessive. But when we get to the 19th century, it's just completely comical.
yeah. Oh yeah. No, no. It becomes it becomes quite ridiculous.
Mm. And so for the last patron for this evening, we now come to Ludwig the First grandson, Ludwig II of Bavaria. So he was actually friends with Wagner and patronized him. And this is a statue of Ludwig II outside of the Warnfried Villa, which is a villa that Ludwig had built and gifted to Wagner to stay in. So again, we've got that old patronage relationship where I will give you accommodation to live at, and I'll give you a salary, and patronize your work. So, except obviously a musical theatrical aspect rather than a painting one.
Yes, and of course, people should think of course one of the most famous examples of Ludwig II, of course, is Neuschwanstein, the great castle. Yes, uh, which was a sort of absolute fantasy, partially based upon again romantic ideas, conjured up by his sort of obsession with Wagner. I think it's a very interesting inverse relationship where the patron in this case comes to Wagner reverentially. The patron comes to his artist with almost a sense of, well, you are so, you are such a universal genius and so great that it is of course, my esteemed pleasure to give you my patronage, which of course is an inversion of the way that this would have been considered in earlier times. Of course, the artist was, as I said, was the artisan. The artist was the person who came to lend his powers to the kind of to the greatness of the patron. And I think that in by this point it becomes reversed. Ludwig II having his own personal and political issues, but yeah, a kind of inversion of the artist patron model.
Mm. Yeah, Ludwig the Second is very fascinating because obviously with the Neuschwanstein here, so this was um obviously I obviously the other sort of great callback movement of the 19th century, other than neoclassicism, was the Gothic revival, and you can really see that in something like a Neuschwanstein. And furthermore, it's interesting because if you look at a lot of the architectural projects that Ludwig II patronized, they're all very baroque, like the Linderhof Palace, etc. And because essentially he was LARPing as like Louis XIV for France, because he kind of saw himself as like a like some sort of reincarnation of him, and he called himself the Moon King because obviously Louis the Grand, Louis XIV was known as the Roi Soleil, the Sun King. So you sort of must have this sort of I'm going to withdraw off into this complete fantasy, and I'm going to patronize all these works to sort of reinforce my fantasy.
Yes, exactly. Whereas, of course, in the case of the Sun King, I mean, it is reinforcing a kind of innate greatness, and in the case of by the time you get to Ludwig II, it's it is just a sort of almost a kind of almost childish madness, you know. Um,
Well, he was
you know,
called the Mad
it
King, Ludwig
again,
II.
the
So
Mad King. I mean, where how true that was in a real sense of madness is a question. But again, I mean, it becomes it goes from, of course, great temporal power to kind of a kind of, as I said, a kind of fancy dress, a kind of just sort of self-indulgence rather than of course, an eye towards the reinforcement of temporal greatness. It just becomes a kind of decadent fantasy in a way.
Well, it's interesting because one aspect as well of patronage is by patronising these various works, you've actually spread the influence of certain styles. So with obviously Ludwig I, you're spreading neoclassicism by building the Valhalla, and in Ludwig II's case, by patronising Wagner and building Neuschwanstein, you're spreading obviously nationalistic romanticism, because Ludwig II was a and both Ludwig I were both German nationalists, which I find to be very odd considering they were ostensibly absolute monarchs of one part of Germany. It's very, very odd. Why are you for German nationalism? Surely German nationalism is not in your interest. So,
yes, which is why I sort of characterize it as being a almost so much personal fantasy rather than a kind of real political strategy, of promoting these things. It becomes a sort of love of an aesthetic more than a kind of love of a coherent, of a kind of politically coherent, philosophy. But of course, in the end, it was extraordinarily influential, if not politically, but then certainly in the, as you said, in the promotion of a certain style or a certain a certain aesthetic outlook.
certainly. Well, that was that's the last image for this evening, Mr. D. So thank you so much for coming on. Are there any final comments or thoughts you want to share?
No, I mean, it's been wonderful having the conversation, and sort of touches on so many sort of interesting moments and artists that I admire. So I thank you very much for inviting me on and hosting me. And yes, I look forward to talking to you again.
Well, thank you. And all I have to say on the end of this subject is I would like to see more patronage of artists in the future if we can ever get ourselves out of the troublesome mess we are in the modern world. But that remains to be seen. In terms of this channel next week, unfortunately, where it is the US election, that I think too many people are going to be busy watching that, and because I know the Lotus Eaters are doing an election night stream, and I know the Old Glory Club are also doing their own one as well. So I think people are going to be far too busy paying attention to that. So there will not be an episode next week, but the week after I hope to return as usual. So thank you everybody for watching, and good night.